The lightsaber has been a part of Star Wars since the release of the fourth episode. Wherever you look in the franchise, you either hear or see them. We have become so accustomed to their existence that we didn't notice how they evolved from a simple weapon into something greater, how something elegant turned into something showy, how the Jedi changed it, and not always for the better. Today, we want to discover what a lightsaber truly is. Let's start a little bit from afar. In 1949, Joseph Campbell introduced his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, in which he presented the concept of the monomyth or the universal myth. According to his theory, all the world's legends are built on a single template. The hero must go on a journey. Along the way, he meets a mentor or a friend, faces obstacles that cause him to die and be reborn, but also transform, ultimately defeating evil and returning home. This is a very rough explanation, and the idea has been challenged and supplemented many times. But it is impossible to deny that myths are built on such elements. It is the basis, the cliché, and the original Star Wars trilogy perfectly fits into the concept of the monomyth. Luke finds the droids, they urge him to go on a journey, he meets the mentor Obi-Wan, engages in a duel with Darth Vader, dies and goes to complete his training, transforms, is reborn, and defeats evil. So in essence, we get a classic story of a knight who goes on a journey, becomes stronger, and ultimately must defeat an evil wizard. But what is one common mandatory element in such knight stories? The sword. Starting with Merlin presenting Arthur with a magical blade, continuing with Aragorn and Narsil in The Lord of the Rings, and ending with the Guilliman and the Emperor's sword in Warhammer. Of course, there are occasions where lightsabers in the prequels are common, but in the original trilogy, they are a unique rarity. Over 3 films, we only saw 4 of them. Anakin's lightsaber, Obi-Wan's lightsaber, Luke's lightsaber, and Darth Vader's lightsaber. And their rarity, their uniqueness, makes the lightsabers magical. They can cut through anything, protect their owner from blasters, akin to the magic of some Excalibur or any of the examples I mentioned above. However, over time, Star Wars became more complex. People have supplemented and updated the concept of the lightsaber. The laser sword eventually ceased to be something unique and rare. Of course, it is still a weapon of the Jedi and the Sith, but we have seen many times how ordinary, unworthy people took this weapon in their hands and fought quite fiercely with it. And it's quite ironic that in the development of the Star Wars franchise, just as in real history, everything happened exactly the same way, starting from swords for the elite, often legendary in status, to shivs that were elements of clothing or weapons for self-defense for anyone. Such development of the sword can be traced through the legends of various peoples. The difficult production of such a weapon always made it expensive and elitist, and rarity begets rumors. Rumors turn into legends. In myths, a sword is often given to a hero by a supernatural entity to defeat evil. Again, referring back to Excalibur, it is given to Arthur by the Lady of the Lake. The sword has always been interpreted by people as a symbol of justice, strength, and courage. Why? Because a warrior wields a sword, and this warrior, in turn, is a strong protector of the weak in the eyes of the common folk. And who are the Jedi, if not protectors of the weak and oppressed? Who else but them should possess a weapon that carries such a meaning? Therefore, a lightsaber is not just a weapon, toy, or tool initially. We understand that lightsabers are not just glowing sticks, but indeed one of the fundamental elements in the myth. But every sword has its beginning, and it was a dark one. The story begins tens of thousands of years before the events of the films. On various planets there were strange pyramids called Tho-Yor. Built by an unknown civilization, they attracted force-sensitive beings. At some point the pyramids opened and summoned all Force users inside them. These turned out to be spacecraft that transported all the arrivals to the planet Tython, where the Jedi Order was formed. They did not preach the light side or the dark side. They adhered to balance. Those who leaned too heavily towards one side were sent to the moons of the planet, the dark and the light moons. There, those who deviated from the teachings of the Order were supposed to meditate, contemplating the same moon. When a heretic returned to balance, they had the right to come back home. Everything was proceeding as usual, until they encountered the Rakata Empire. The Rakata were able to expand because they possessed super technologies, the price for which was the dark side. For example, to move their ships, they used force-sensitive beings, such as living batteries, or they used the dark side to power the weapon of interest to us, the lightsaber. The core of the lightsaber was a focusing crystal that, through force alchemy, was altered, and by channeling dark side energy through itself, it transformed into an energy blade. In its characteristics, it was not different from a lightsaber. And here we encounter yet another such element of legends called the cursed blade. Swords in myths, of course, are not always something good. It is, after all, an exclusive weapon for killing. It's not an axe, not a spear, not a bow with arrows, which are tools for building and hunting parallelly, right? A sword is needed only to kill people. Therefore, in legends, cursed and evil swords are naturally encountered. One of the first, possibly the progenitor, is the sword Tyrfing from the ancient Icelandic The Saga of Hervor. In it, this sword was forged by captive dwarves, and according to legend, it cannot be sheathed until it has been stained with blood. There are also the cursed katanas of the blacksmith Muramasa, which, according to tales, were imbued with hatred and malice, driving their owners to kill. Black and white thinking operates like clockwork throughout human history, turning harsh, cruel reality without any inherent meaning into stories about good and bad weapons. And so, for the followers of balance, such a bad weapon was unacceptable, but they could not withstand the war without it. Therefore, they studied the technology of lightsaber creation and adopted it. The Jedi had blue lightsabers, while the Rakata had yellow ones. Moreover, the Rakata's weapons were more akin to pikes. Thanks to the acquired lightsabers, the Order of Balance won the war, but split into those who wanted to destroy the endless Rakata Empire and those who wished to return to peaceful existence. The symbol of such a division became the very same lightsabers. In response to the emergence of followers of the exclusively dark side, there were adherents, naturally in opposition to the light. A brutal civil war erupted, resulting in the creation of the familiar Jedi Order. There were many more wars, but in the end, the Dark Ones were expelled, and the technology of lightsaber creation was lost. However, the noble Jedi still desired to possess this immense power. Therefore, during the wars of the Dark Jedi and the Light Jedi, the first proto-sabers appeared. In their design, they resembled modern samples, with one exception. They did not have a compact power source. A battery was attached to the belt or back of the owner, and a cable ran from it to the hilt of the sword. To put it mildly, the imperfect design was a real pain in the ass for the Jedi until another conflict with followers of the dark side occurred, because what would Star Wars be without conflicts? The exiled Dark Jedi at some point found the planet Korriban and its Sith Empire. With their resources, a new perfect weapon was created. Time passed. The Sith Empire was in stagnation, but their empire mostly used forged swords. The Sith preferred them because a lightsaber immediately cauterized the wound, unlike metal. However, their Sith swords were not much inferior to proto-sabers or powered swords, because they had their own tricks. Accumulating lightning inside the blade, excellent reflection of powered swords. In general, they didn't care. They didn't care so much that the Sith invented at that time the concept of the modern lightsaber, which didn't even take root among them. However, as a result of yet another conflict, the Republic defeated the Sith, and the Jedi gained the technology to create lightsabers by delving into the spoils of their defeated enemies. At its core, a lightsaber is a cylinder made of iron or other material, inside which is a complex closed energy supply system. The power source supplies energy through a kyber crystal, which greatly amplifies the energy as it passes through, resonates, flies out of the hilt, and is held in a stable blade form by a magnetic field. Moreover, the flow, again with the help of a magnetic field, is closed in a loop through which energy flows back to the battery, and is only spent when the circuit is interrupted, that is, when the blade begins to cut something and encounters another sword. From the point of view of physics, such a circuit is even possible. This type of energy is called reactive. However, there are, of course, problems here. Firstly, by returning energy back to the source, conductors heat up one way or another, that is, they convert electricity into heat. This means that energy in our case is constantly being consumed. Moreover, at such energy levels it should heat up, well, to put it mildly, significantly. Of course, lightsabers have superconductors that do not heat up due to lack of resistance. But in reality, superconductors at room temperature do not yet exist. Secondly, the magnetic fields needed to return the energy back and contain the plasma inside the blade are either practically impossible to create or possible, but they will work slightly differently. If you attach the sword to something that conducts a magnetic field, you will most likely change the shape of the blade, and all the plasma will leak out. In short, there are many such details. At the moment, we can only create a variation of a proto-saber. We are still very far from creating a lightsaber, especially from the next generations. Besides standard lightsabers, there are many variations. Different blade quantities, blade sizes, widths, hilt shapes, and those extreme models that combine all of these. One of the most famous, of course, is the double-bladed lightsaber, also known as the saber staff or light staff. The blade was very popular among the followers of the dark side, as one of the first Sith lords, Exar Kun, wielded such a lightsaber and was practically its inventor. However, the hilt was of standard size, and it was more convenient to use it with one hand. According to the lore, this is a very complex weapon to master and requires years of training to avoid cutting off one of your own limbs. In our mundane reality, such a weapon is, to put it mildly, ineffective. The lightsaber staff must always be held in the middle by the hilt. The advantage of a real staff is that you can at any moment shift your grip to another end and extend the distance at which you can strike. With the lightsaber version, as you understand, this is impossible. Therefore, the creators of such a weapon consider its advantage to be that you can fight two opponents simultaneously, as Darth Maul did in Episode 1. But again, in reality, no. The duel between Qui-Gon and Kenobi was a choreographed performance. The strikes were all planned, it looks impressive, but it's unrealistic. When you strike with one part of the saber to the right, the other blade points to the left. Therefore, you can only wield one part of the staff, and parrying or blocking with two blades simultaneously is out of the question. Spinning the saber staff impressively is also useless. You may confuse an inexperienced fencer, but they will quickly realize that they can strike at your hands, which are in a very disadvantageous and unprotected position while you perform all these tricks. Moreover, in a small space, these staffs are generally inconvenient since they require room to maneuver. In general, the weapon is impressive but ineffective in real life, and we'll come back to it later. By the way, there is a variation of the saber staffs used by the Inquisitors of the Disney Empire. They have the exact same problems, but additionally the saber's blades can spin. This lightsaber helicopter has some advantages, and the spinning can better defend against blaster shots. Somehow, Inquisitors can even fly using it. But in a duel with another swordmaster, the mechanism will be ineffective for the same reasons. Furthermore, saber staffs can split into two sabers. For example, such was wielded by Asajj Ventress or Cal Kestis. This variation is very convenient because, excluding many of the previously mentioned drawbacks, it can also catch the opponent off guard. However, again, dual-wielding swords is a common trope in entertainment media. In real historical partner combat, it is a rare exception, especially with two full-sized swords. As a rule, fighting with dual weapons was common in duels, and it was more often a combination of a dagger and a sword, rather than a sword and a sword. The problem with using dual weapons is that, first of all, in real life, you can't swing them around for long. It requires quite a lot of strength and endurance. Secondly, there's still the same problem. They are not small items, and in some narrow corridor, you won't be able to swing both effectively at the same time. And thirdly, we, after all, are single processor beings, and it is quite difficult for us to swing both arms in a coordinated manner. For proficient combat in such a style, one needs to train for a long time or be born ambidextrous. And while lightsabers allow the hands not to strain from weight, the issues with ambidexterity, and the fact that in narrow corridors a second lightsaber would rather get in the way, all this remains. Of course, the second lightsaber can be used to defend or parry blaster shots, but a shield, which Jedi never use, would be more efficient for dealing with such scenarios. This is somewhat justified because with the second hand, they can use the Force, but on the other hand, with a second lightsaber, they manage to use the Force along with the weapon. In short, you get the idea. Using dual weapons is, once again, impressive but rather complicated. And in a duel or on the battlefield where your life directly depends on everything happening, even if the second lightsaber complicates the fight by 10%, a 10% chance of a fatal outcome isn't something you'd risk lightly. We saw this clearly in the fight between Asajj and Anakin, where using the dual weapon style didn't work well against strong and aggressive strikes. However, the creators, of course, consulted various swordsmen and masters of bladed weapons. That's why, over time, what I've mentioned gradually appeared in Star Wars. But dual wielding wasn't limited to full-sized lightsabers. Here's a short lightsaber, also known as a shoto or light dagger. As I mentioned before, in real life, a short blade often complemented the primary weapon in duels. You use the standard lightsaber to try to reach your opponent, and the shorter one for defense. It doesn't need to be long. It doesn't restrict you. A notable user here was Ahsoka Tano when she was the Padawan of Anakin Skywalker. So there's nothing to nitpick here, except if she didn't use the reverse grip in battles. In real life, it only decreases the attack radius, restricts the fencer in the variety of strikes, and forces the wrists into an unnatural angle during swings. So again, yes, the reverse grip is a flashy move, but not an effective one. Another representative of Shoto fencing in the expanded universe was Luke Skywalker. There's an interesting story here. After the death of Yoda, Anakin took the Master's lightsaber and used it as a Shoto, which he used in addition to his standard blade. Speaking of standard lightsabers, the hilt of a typical lightsaber could be of a non-standard shape, which could alter the style of wielding it. Among duelists, the curved hilt was popular because it allowed for more precise strikes. In our reality, curved hilts are found on most sabers, cutlasses, and sometimes even certain swords. Typically, such a design permits effective thrusting and cutting strikes with the proposed skill. Of course, the most famous owner of a lightsaber with a curved hilt was Count Dooku. The late Sir Christopher Lee, who played him, was an experienced duelist, and thus requested this specific hilt design from George Lucas. Thus, despite his advanced age, he could independently participate in some of the duel scenes without constantly relying on stunt doubles. What if we lengthen the hilt? The result is the so-called lightsaber pike. An extended hilt, several times longer, is considered by us, and not only by us, the most convenient. The problem with a lightsaber lies in its balance, as the weight is shifted towards the hilt, while the blade itself essentially weighs nothing. Therefore, fighting with such a weapon becomes, if not impossible, then at least challenging. Jedi and Sith spend years training to wield a lightsaber, getting accustomed to and learning to handle its disbalanced nature. The lightsaber pike solves this problem. Its long hilt allows the lightsaber blade to be kept further away from one's extremities. Additionally, with a long hilt, one can more accurately perform thrusting strikes. In short, it has so many advantages that we are even surprised they have not yet appeared in the new canon. But okay, we have learned what happens if we extend the hilts. What about the opposite? Light foils were common among the adherents of the Makrosa order. This was a sort of cult of assassins, followers of the dark side, who served the nobility. But after this order left the system, the light foils became an attribute of the aristocracy. Unfortunately, there is not much else to say about them. The light foils were intended solely for one-on-one duels and were not suitable for real combat. Their technology of creation differed, making them less powerful, though we do not know by how much. Though according to Star Wars lore, this weapon was not very practical and did not spread widely. In real life, I think you suspect that light foils were quite commonly used by many armies and were fairly effective. However, we will talk about thrusting strikes with light foils a bit later. As mentioned earlier, a lightsaber contains a kyber crystal, which essentially creates the lightsaber blade. One crystal is good, but two are better. Indeed, a lightsaber could hold not just one, but possibly even 2 or 3 crystals if desired. This allowed the blade to be altered at any moment, for instance, to extend it, even by several times. Such lightsabers were used by Exar Kun and Darth Vader. Yes, Luke's father had such a lightsaber, not only in the expanded canon, but also in the official one, although only in the comics. If you want a lightsaber that is no longer but thicker, please feel free to imagine anything you desire. Here is the Light Club, also known as a great lightsaber or great saber. In terms of characteristics, it is no different except for the thickness of the blade. Typically, such light clubs were used by guys of massive builds for whom the standard blade was unsuitable, like the hilt was too thin for a giant paw, which in reality can be quite practical. If you think that ridiculously huge swords from anime did not exist in real life, you are mistaken. There is, for example, the sword of Pierre Gerloff's-Donia, who was a French pirate and a fighter for independence. His sword measures over 2 meters and weighs almost 7 kilograms. To put it into perspective, one of the longest conventional swords, the Zweihander, measures from 170 to 180 centimeters, weighing up to 3 kilograms. The enormous sword was used as a banner, but for Pierre, it was obtained as a trophy. And with his height, according to sources also over 2 meters, he used it as his primary weapon. Of course, this is an exception to the rule, but such warriors with the height and strength of Pierre were rare, although in the Star Wars universe, large lightsabers are, firstly, not heavy, and secondly, there are plenty of aliens who are 2 or 3 times stronger, taller, and more massive than even the largest humans. And what if I need a lightsaber with multiple blades but not a double-bladed one? Such things do exist, and of course we are talking about Kylo Ren's lightsaber. The crossguard lightsaber appeared in the canon due to a damaged kyber crystal. To prevent the energy from the cracks from exploding the saber in the owner's hands, nozzles were attached to the hilt to divert the energy and create these small blades. It has often been said that this thing is more likely to cut off your fingers or injure you. The crossguard on a lightsaber is a good idea, but only a standard one. Though a similar blade to Kylo Ren's appears in the expanded canon as well. A saber with an additional side blade was used by one of the Jedi during the Clone Wars era, but the essence is the same, albeit the blade was angled at 45 degrees. In my opinion, it's just a dumb idea, as are the lightsaber tonfas from the game Force Unleashed. Tonfa is a blunt force weapon originating from Southeast Asia. You have seen it many times because old-style police batons are nothing but tonfas made of wood. Lightsaber tonfas, thanks to their design, allowed for both attacking and defending. Grips, cutting strikes were also part of the arsenal with this weapon. But in Lucas's fantastical universe, it's the same situation as with the lightsaber crossguard. Tonfa is a blunt force weapon, not a cutting one. In reality, it is entirely wooden, and at any moment it can be grabbed and used as a club. And the specific techniques, often relying on inertia from spinning, just injure you if you make it not blunt but cutting. In short, it's impressive, but kind of dumb. Virtually all the weapons I have listed are very impressive but not effective, like the lightsaber crossguard. But mostly a lot of people dislike just the crossguard. Separately, I would like to talk about the dark saber, with which everything is not so simple. The sword in culture also acts as a symbol of power because with a sword you can kill, and this gives you power over life and death. Accordingly, to become a knight, the ruler must conduct a dedication ritual specifically with a blade. The same goes here. The dark saber is not just a weapon but one of the symbols of unity and power on Mandalore. It seems the hilt is different. It's black, and the blade looks a little different, but in reality there is no difference from a regular lightsaber. However, it has enormous symbolic significance. Another unusual lightsaber was a saber with a blaster in the hilt belongs to Ezra Bridger, and the idea might actually be quite good. It doesn't quite fit with Jedi dogma, but during the times of the Empire the Order was no more, so no one cared. In reality, sword-gun hybrids, by the way, existed. As a rule, they were not used in combat. Rather, they served as beautiful weapons in a collection or hanging on a wall, because you can't aim properly with such a weapon as you might suspect, and a gun is not needed in close quarters and would only get in the way. Probably the craziest thing is a Japanese sub-officer's sword pistol. In 1945, it was found by American soldiers in an unassembled state. Some naval officer made a custom order to attach a blade to a Nambu pistol, which was already an awkward weapon, but one way or another, a sword gun looks like a very inconvenient and illogical idea. However, if you still want something unique in a practical sense, the most hyped is probably the light whip. A light whip, also known as an energy whip or a laser whip, was a rare variation of the lightsaber. As a rule, it was not made of familiar plasma, but from a material that could conduct kyber crystal energy, such as cortosis. Those encountering such an enemy will face difficulties due to the specificity and rarity of the weapon, but its problems will become apparent fairly quickly. Using whips in confined spaces is practically impossible, and for effective strikes and proper control, you need to use the force. And now imagine that you must simultaneously focus on controlling the whip and ensure the enemy doesn't get too close, because a light whip works well only at a fairly long distance, and you end up with yet another not-so-effective weapon. In the expanded universe, Obi-Wan briefly wielded a light whip. Another wielder was the Sith Lady Lumia, who served Darth Vader and Palpatine as an assassin. There was also the Sith Lady Githany, who lived during the time of the creator of the famous Rule of Two by Darth Bane, and was his lover, so whips, as usual, are more associated with women. And once again, it's flair for the sake of flair. As you may have noticed, this issue is present in almost all wielders of unusual lightsabers, and this leads to amusing situations. Some conventions we are willing to accept, while others we are not. The boundary of disbelief is very faint. It's quite easy to overdo it and mess everything up. The lightsaber staff is an even more foolish weapon than the crossguard lightsaber. We've explained its problems, but at least the crossguard lightsaber exists, and it can somehow be justified by Jedi reflexes that would prevent self-harm. A double-bladed lightsaber, however, never existed in real life, because it is super inconvenient, super ineffective, and so on. And yet, almost everyone accepts it as a given, and does not blame Lucas or the filmmakers for its absurdity. We are willing to overlook these conventions for the sake of coolness. To be fair, there are only a couple of non-foolish lightsabers made for coolness, namely Dooku's curved hilt lightsaber, the lightsaber pike, and Shoto in the second hand, but no more. However, all this flair is needed not only to entertain us, but also for various cool subtexts and meanings. For example, to depict the character of a person not only with the blade or the shape of the hilt, but even with its design. For instance, one of Palpatine's lightsabers was made of electrum with inlays of other precious metals. It looked flashy but was designed for concealed wearing, so it was shorter and had no parts that could snag on clothing. This combination of details shows us who Palpatine is. Secretive, practical, but with a love for luxury. In the end, he completely abandoned the lightsaber. In the original trilogy and the 9th film, Sidious exclusively uses the Force, showing his disdain for the symbol of power. He does not need a lightsaber, as if it were some crutch for him, because he is the power. The next point I want to discuss combines both coolness and hidden meanings. Of course, it's the rainbow. We are super attracted to this stuff. Colorful Ninja Turtles, Power Rangers, and so on. But, aside from our attraction to all things colorful, it's also convenient because it allows us to easily convey some emotions with color. Raphael would be the most aggressive red kryptonite turned Superman into a villain, and so on. Accordingly, the color of the lightsaber reflects not only which side of the Force the wielder belongs to, but also their character. And the primary lightsaber colors are based on the classic RGB red, green, and blue. The basic set of colors, the combination of which gives us shades and other colors. A red lightsaber is characteristic of the Sith. It is probably unnecessary to explain that this color denotes aggression. Most of the followers of the Jedi Order wielded blue lightsabers. In general, in various cultures, blue represents calmness, restraint, and coldness. Therefore, to the adherents of the light side of the Force, preaching precisely these ideals, blue is a perfect fit. Slightly less, but still significant, was green. In culture, green reflects rebirth and balance. It is no coincidence that after losing his first lightsaber, Luke obtained a blade of this very color. Again, the theme of rebirth, which aligns with the canon of the hero with 1,000 faces. Of course, in reality, it was due to the specifics of filming against a blue sky. But symbolisms must also be used. Green was wielded by the diplomats of the Order, and one of the pillars of diplomacy is balance. But RGB was invented to mix all the primary colors. You have surely seen these circles like Euler circles, but with RGB. Here you have the three major combinations. The first is purple, the lightsaber of Mace Windu, which, as you probably know, appeared because Jackson himself wished it so. In everyday life, purple usually symbolizes luxury, sometimes humanism. But at the same time, purple is the result of mixing blue and red, which conveniently led to this color symbolizing the balance between the dark and light sides in the Star Wars universe. This perfectly aligns with the fact that Mace Windu constantly walked the line between light and darkness. The second is the combination of red and green, which gives us yellow. Such lightsabers were wielded by Jedi sentinels. In general, this color was more widespread in the expanded canon, for example, in the Old Republic, but unfortunately, it does not hold any particular symbolism regarding color. The third is blue and green. In theory, we get cyan, but these are already some shades and very similar to light blue, which was initially due to illumination, not true blue. So cyan was also present in the expanded universe, as were a bunch of other shades, but unfortunately, it never had any significance. And there is the most boring yet simultaneously symbolic color, the color of complete balance. These are white lightsabers. White is a symbol of purity and light, but it is also a combination of all spectra of light, or all RGB. White was preferred by the gray Jedi, who preached balance. Often it is depicted not as pure white, but as grayish white. A classic example is Ahsoka Tano after she left the Order and hid from the Empire. The color of a lightsaber, by the way, appears after the Force Adept fills the Kyber crystal with the energy of the Force. They were mined on many planets in the universe, but the most famous place is Ilum. During the ritual of obtaining the Kyber crystal, young adepts had to venture into deep caves and acquire the crystals themselves. As these minerals had a powerful connection with the Force, it could be said that the crystal chose its owner. The crystals predominantly had a connection with the light side. So if a stone fell into the hands of a Sith, the mineral would start to bleed and acquire a red color, which symbolically reflected this. However, more often than not, the Sith preferred synthetic crystals, which they grew themselves. In this way, they could select the color of the blade. Additionally, these crystals had the ability to destabilize the energy of their living counterparts. Plus, they were supposedly slightly more powerful, which, when combined, was a sort of mockery of the Jedi. Kyber crystals are also very durable. They can withstand a lightsaber explosion and extremely high temperatures, even up to the core temperatures of planets, making them nearly indestructible. Yet besides color, they could also come in different types. Crystals from the planet Barab, also called Barab or ingots, could make lightsaber blades even higher in temperature and gave the blade a natural red color. Moreover, they were slightly radioactive. It would be fascinating if the natural appearance of the Sith could be explained by this little fact. In addition, there are ghost fire crystals found in the expanded universe. These were semi-transparent and made the lightsaber blade almost invisible. Lordian crystals allowed one to predict the future, while Solari crystals made the lightsaber blade wider, making it easier to deflect blaster shots. Lucas, inspired by samurai films, made lightsaber duels similar to those. An amusing detail is that Lucas initially wanted to give metal swords to the characters, but realized that such a concept would look somewhat incongruous against the backdrop of spaceships and blasters, leading him to the idea of the lightsaber. He also had the idea to make lightsabers heavy, thereby justifying the need to hold them with both hands. He abandoned this notion for the sake of logic, but the two-handed grip remained, as it all traced back to kendo and Lucas's love for Akira Kurosawa's films. Later in the franchise's development, this style was named Shien, characterized by constant attacks and counterattacks. Typically, detractors of this form cite the fence's passivity, as during attacks, the majority of practitioners move rather stiffly. However, with increased mastery, all of this can be corrected. Users of this technique are capable of deflecting blaster shots back at the shooter, and it is within this form that the technique of throwing a lightsaber is prevalent. Its master was Darth Vader, who further refined it into Degem, so a style more oriented towards dueling. Battles in the Xian style are often criticized in the original trilogy, which is quite logical as they appear very dull. This criticism is particularly relevant to episodes 4 through 6 due to the different era. However, in the prequels, this form appears much faster. The meme-worthy scene from episode 6, where Anakin and Obi-Wan twirl their lightsabers in front of each other, essentially represents the main tactic of Xian. You must deceive and confuse the opponent, barraging them with a flurry of strikes until they break down. But after Anakin was placed in the suit, his movements became more restrained, and the fancy twists gave way to precision. The focus on the quality of strikes, rather than their quantity, became the foundation of how Darth Vader fought. Yet, Lucas, with the help of stunt coordinator Nick Gillard, developed another form of lightsaber combat that was meant to be the direct opposite of the slow duels in the original trilogy. Thus, the Ataru form was born, which relies on acrobatics, force techniques, and the sheer power of the lightsaber itself. This technique most accurately reflects lightsaber combat as an artistic representation, since the numerous jumps and tricks look impressive, but are unrelated to actual fencing and are ineffective. Even within the Star Wars universe, this style was considered flawed. Count Dooku roughly expressed his opinion about this form as follows: "I am well aware of the weaknesses and ridiculous acrobatics of this style. Force them to jump and then strike them through from kidneys to shoulder blades." The style is indeed all about showboating. Jumps, flips, and spins using the Force are designed for quick encounters against a single opponent in open space. The sweeping attacks barely shield the body from the opponent's strikes. After Qui-Gon's death, who actively fought in this style, the technique gradually began to fade away. Qui-Gon's apprentice, Obi-Wan, himself transitioned from the Ataru form to another, Soresu, a defensive technique. First of all, it shows itself well in defending against blaster and other weapons, but is almost unfit for attacks. As a rule, the strategy is to keep the lightsaber as close to oneself as possible and constantly move it, listening to one's own reflexes until you come up with a way to outmaneuver or until the opponent tires. This perfectly characterizes Obi-Wan's development as a character, and in the subsequent trilogy films, it was exactly so. For example, thanks to Christopher Lee, they got the form most resembling real fencing techniques, Makashi. The style is primarily aimed at a duel against a single opponent with a lightsaber. It is indispensable in duels, but ineffective against multiple enemies or blasters. Moreover, even the master of this technique is mostly defenseless against the later developed forms. Unlike many other styles, this form involves holding the lightsaber with only one hand. The strikes are precise, aimed at maintaining distance, and include feints peculiar to certain real saber fencing schools. By the end of the fight with the master of this form, the opponent, if still alive, would receive many small and painful wounds, meant to deplete physically and mentally. By the way, for this form, one must have a trained wrist since most strikes are made with its help. This style was masterfully wielded by Count Dooku, which, of course, reveals his character. Duelists are well associated with aristocrats, which is what Darth Tyrannus is. Here, we must unveil the formidable badass Mace Windu, who walks the edge and invents his style, Vapad, the most aggressive form. The attacks strive to be unpredictable and often rely on the use of negative emotions at specific moments. An inexperienced Jedi risks falling to the dark side. Additionally, the strength of the technique depends on how many forms the duelist knew before and how well they mastered them. Vapad generally appears somewhat disjointed. The alternation of smooth and abrupt movements can leave the impression of an inexperienced fencer. In reality, however, all maneuvers are strictly controlled and delivered with a specific goal, dependent on the surrounding circumstances. There are other techniques like the first form for training younglings or Nieman, which tries to combine all styles, but these are not as interesting. What is fascinating is that all these techniques predominantly involve slashing attacks, although the form of the saber quite actively lends itself to thrusting more often than slashing. From a cinematic perspective, such a choice is also dictated by visual appeal. Lightsaber fighting is artistic fencing involving many beautiful sweeping strikes, jumps, and other elements. Slashing strikes look more spectacular than thrusts, and since the Sith were practically absent from the lore for a long time, all these combat styles with sweeping movements were invented by the Jedi. We even theorize that there are almost no thrusting strikes because of their potentially higher lethality. A Jedi's goal is, above all, to neutralize the opponent, not to kill them. In Lucas's trilogies, they loved to chop off hands and sometimes heads, but always to chop. Because of the lightsaber's properties, a wound would be cauterized. There would be no blood loss, so losing a limb would not be as lethal. With a thrusting strike, it's harder to hit a small target, such as a wrist, but hitting the body is straightforward, and such a strike will be fatal in 99 cases out of 100, which is pretty funny. Like, a slashing strike against Darth Maul is not fatal, but a thrusting strike against Qui-Gon is fatal. It's always slightly surprised me, though. The main problem with an injury is actually bleeding. So the remaining Sith don't use thrusting strikes either, again because all forms of lightsaber combat were created by the Jedi. Moreover, many forms were developed with the goal of deflecting blaster shots, which implies many swings and not thrusts. And I think the history of lightsabers is astonishing. Originally created by dark side adepts for killing, the Jedi, in a sense, are cosmic Buddhists. The dogmas are similar. In Buddhism, anger, desire, and negative emotions are fundamentally considered one of the pillars of evil in this world. The Jedi preach the renunciation of all these vivid emotions and strive for absolute harmony. But the religion of the Jedi has something that Buddhism lacks, a real, tangible embodiment of what they fight against, the Sith, who feed on all these emotions and naturally build empires. Therefore, the Jedi had to accept a simple truth: good must have fists. The Sith created a weapon that uses only the dark side, and we will use it a little. What else can be done? The weapon was lost, we don't know how to recreate it, so we'll make an analog, even if it's inconvenient. The Sith improved this weapon. Fine, we'll take it, and who cares that it's once again Sith? There was no question of pride or anything like that at all. Moreover, once having tried something magical, essentially omnipotent and unstoppable, they could no longer give it up. However, upon obtaining this technology, a show-off gradually began. Of course, the Jedi had a couple more wars and a few defeats, but they dominated for a long time, and at some point there were only 2 Sith according to the old canon for a whole 1,000 years. And to me, it is very logical to consider the emergence of many variations of the lightsaber in this context, where, out of the huge variety, only 2.5 modifications are truly effective. And from this perspective, we see all these 7 forms of lightsaber combat. All of them are ineffective in terms of war. They try not to kill, but to defend or at most maim. After all, they are knights and protectors like Buddhists. They must play nobility. Yes, from the point of view of a fairy tale, all this is justified. Here we have the good Jedi and the bad Sith. The Jedi do not kill. Their weapons are only for self-defense, and they must swing them beautifully. But it is interesting to ponder the Jedi not only as fairy tale heroes, but also as real individuals, since legends and myths always have some foundation. And as a result, it is very interesting. The omnipotent killing weapon was adopted for defense, which is reflected in how the Jedi wield them, and how the Sith are forced to wield them, because that's how history developed. And all this diversity is meaningless and purely for show. Interesting,